Hello everyone and welcome to another Cyber Lounge webinar. I'm joined this time by Purav Desai of Bramfitt Technology Labs. This time we're going to be talking about vulnerability management and why it matters. Purav, if you'd like to give a brief introduction of yourself, it'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Oscar. So hi everyone, morning. I'm Purav Desai. I'm currently cybersecurity specialist at Bramfitt Technology Labs. Just under 2 years in cybersecurity. And in my last role, I spent best part of a year doing vulnerability management. So I thought I'd share it with you guys.
Okay, great. And I think we're just going to go right over to the slides. Here we go. And Purav, yeah, if you could begin your talk now. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Oscar. So why does vulnerability management matter? So, nowadays tools are getting much better in terms of EDR for incident response and alert triage and things like that. We're constantly advising users about phishing emails. So all these mitigations are improving, but something that's being overlooked or being missed are vulnerabilities. And effectively, vulnerabilities can be entry points for attackers. So what can happen is an attacker will know that you're using a particular software, more so the version as well associated to it. They can very easily check online to see what exploits are available with that combination to achieve things like privilege escalation or denial of service. And so this is where it can become an entry point for the attackers. More so than that, these exploits are really easily available. So there's a website called ExploitsDB. Some of you guys may have heard of it. You can find millions of exploits there associated to commonly found software in enterprise. But again, more so than that, some exploits are actually being really easily integrated into Metasploit. So Metasploit is a sort of penetration testing framework bundled with Kali Linux, and effectively you don't need any special cyber knowledge or technical know-how to execute those exploits. So very easily you can go from zero to hero effectively and take advantage. Also, through doing your vulnerability management discovery, you'll also find leftover software. So you may remember, a few years ago, a user would have potentially installed a very bespoke piece of software to do a particular task. The common example I usually give is PDF readers. Nowadays, you find plethora of PDF readers. Even browsers can be PDF readers. But someone could have installed, let's say, Foxit, for example, to do a very particular task. And depending on your organization, uninstalling software may not be as easily done by the end user. So they would have to sort of raise a support ticket to IT to get that done, which they may have forgotten to do. And through this, you'll find that, a very old version of Foxit, when everyone else is using Adobe, is now being discovered. So it's also good for that. And lastly, it complements the secure by design principle. So there's this whole shift left mentality in cybersecurity, where effectively you want to get involved early on in the project phase to make sure that when anything goes live, it's secure by design effectively. So you've mitigated all your vulnerabilities, any images for servers you're deploying, or abide to a standard golden image, and these kind of things. So that's kind of a summary of why it matters. So if we just move on to the next slide. So moving on to the stages of vulnerability management. So the first stage is discovery. Now, the meme puts it quite well on the right-hand side here, where you don't know what you can protect until you don't know how to protect what you don't know you have, kind of thing. So a lot of companies won't have accurate inventories of their assets. So what can you do? So you can do a passive scan across your internal subnet. This will uncover new devices that you won't even thought of. You can then corroborate this to an inventory list with your IT asset management team. And sort of say, this asset popped up. I don't know what it is. Can you investigate? And again, going back to the previous case of where software is left over, you may find assets or devices left over that, were just plugged in one time and forgotten to take out. So this will also help for that. If you're a smaller organization and you don't have that many devices, you could just do a simple ping sweep. So this will tell you if an asset is online or not, if you get a response. And again, you can corroborate this to an IT asset inventory list and sort of build up a list of assets you have that way. And then lastly, again, discovery. So it's not just about discovering the assets, but it's actually discovering the vulnerabilities. So the way you do this is with two different types of scans. So you have the authenticated scan and the unauthenticated scan. As you may expect, authenticated is with credentials and unauthenticated is without credentials. But it goes a bit further than that. So unauthenticated will give you an outsider's perspective into the asset to see what's vulnerable from an attacker's perspective without even penetrating the asset or getting onto the network. Whereas an authenticated one will allow you to deeply probe the asset for things like certificate issues, software versions, and all of that. So yeah, that's the first stage. You really need to know what you have in your estate to go about protecting them. And then also look at what kind of scans you'd want to set up. So that's the first stage of vulnerability management, which is discovery. So moving on to the next phase. So we have prioritize. Now, you may find thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions even vulnerabilities where to begin, right? So each vulnerability will have a CVE. So a CVE is called Common Vulnerability and Exposure. It's just a way to identify a CVE. Typically, it's in the form CVE dash, the year. So in this case, 2021 dash 1652. So and that's just the way it sort of gets categorized according to MITRE. And with each CVE, you have a CVSS score. So the CVSS score ranges from 0 to 10, 10 being critical, well, 9 to 10 technically being critical, 7 to 9 being high, 5 to 7 being medium, and anything lower than that is a low, and 0 is typically like a none or an informational. So CVSS score isn't everything. So what I mean by this is the example listed below, where you can have a 0 rated vulnerability for anonymous FTP logon. So for those of you guys that may not know, if you have a file share allowing FTP, you can usually authenticate to it by just using a username of anonymous and a password of blank. Now, if this file share had any business critical data, PII sensitive data, despite the point that you'd argue why is it even open in the first place, but let's say it was, then that would soon raise the severity of that vulnerability because that's business critical data, and that could even become a 9 or a 10. So that's kind of what I mean by CVSS score isn't everything. It's a good starting point, but it shouldn't be your be all and end all. Another thing you can do is also look at vulnerabilities that have exploits. So in my eyes, a vulnerability's risk is actualized through a penetration test or through an exploit being available. Because if you have a vulnerability that can cause privilege escalation or arbitrary code execution, it's not until you have an exploit that can actually perform that needed function where that becomes kind of a threat. So that would be one way to do it. Look at your vulnerabilities that have exploits. Look at the devices that they're present on, and start about remediating them. And I'll go on to that in the remediation phase as well. However, not every vulnerability has a CVE ID. So there are vulnerabilities that are basically security misconfigurations. So these can be things like weak passwords, or as you can see on the screen, SMBv1 enabled. Now, some of you guys may remember 4 years ago, the WannaCry ransomware that hit the NHS. So this was effectively SMBv1 being open, which allowed the worm to propagate, and the worm also caused then ransomware. So had they blocked SMBv1, which is a security misconfiguration, this would have eliminated that risk completely. So this is something to look at. So to summarize, the second phase of vulnerability management is prioritization. Use the CVSS score as a starting point, but bear in mind it's not everything. Actualize the risk by looking at what has exploits associated to it, and look at your security configurations and work on improving those. And again, I'll come back to that a bit later. So the third phase is reporting. Now, the reporting is actually very important because this reporting will lead to the remediation. So, a lot of companies will just export the CSV found from various scanners, be it Tenable, be it Qualys, be it Rapid7, and give that to the business. But in my eyes, these reports need to be action focused and full of value. So what do I mean by this? Well, if you present someone just a CSV with 50,000 lines saying these are your vulnerabilities on these assets, where do they even begin? What actually makes sense to them is more to say things like, okay, this vulnerability is present on a key asset, which if this is exploited, this could cause XYZ damage, be it denial of service, be it code execution, privilege escalation, etc. So rather than making it overwhelming for the IT asset managers that actually do the remediation, give them an action-focused report. And as I said in the third point here, work with the business to understand the environment. This is very critical. You want to know what your key assets are if they're externally facing. For example, you can have some vulnerabilities that are remotely exploitable without authentication. If these are present on any external facing assets, this would be ones to prioritize. And again, in your report, you'd want to highlight this to say, please can you prioritize remediation of these assets because they're externally facing, they can be remotely compromised, and this damage could happen. And effectively, again, the last point summarizes it well. The whole point of a report is to actualize the risk. So it's not just about saying these vulnerabilities are present, but it's to say, please fix these because otherwise this will get damaged in this way. And this reporting also comes very useful to explaining to higher level people, so like C-level people who may not be as technical. So once you start speaking risk to them and understanding compliance risks as well, potentially violating policies and such, you'll actually find that you'll get a lot more headway in terms of your reporting and ultimately remediation. So remediation. Now, there's three basic things for remediation. So either you can update the vulnerable software, you can uninstall the old software, or you can apply security controls. So let's talk about them. So updating the software. Now, with this one, you want to be careful because you may have legacy software that, if updated, would cause any issues to your production business systems. So for this, it's a good idea to test. You may have a test environment where you mirror your production systems ideally, or a dev test or a pre-prod, they usually call it, different sort of nomenclature for those environments. And you want to see what's the impact of actually updating the software. Uninstalling the old software is really a good one because that minimizes your attack surface completely. For example, going back to the PDF reader, let's say that one person installed Foxit, but now everyone's moved to Edge as a PDF reader. Well, if you know that no one else is going to have Foxit in the business, just uninstall it, because then you've mitigated all the Foxit-related vulnerabilities, which is greatly improving your security posture and reducing the attack surface. Applying security controls. So again, this goes back to the security misconfigurations I alluded to earlier, where if you block SMBv1, there's no risk of another WannaCry happening, at least, unless there's a more sophisticated version that uses other versions. But anything that's specific to SMBv1 will then be reduced or eliminated completely because you've applied that security control. Another one will be weak passwords. So, nowadays, machines are getting more powerful in terms of password cracking. Have a security policy that says, all passwords must be at least 15 characters in length, contain a special character, various sort of complexity policies that you can set. And then again, you've mitigated the risk of the passwords being compromised as easily. As mentioned before, you may discover some leftover software that's no longer in use. Yeah, so as I said, just uninstall it because this does reduce the attack surface. Policies again, so you can actually prevent software from running through group policy. So there is something called an application disallowed list. So there you can specify certain binaries or certain executables, for example, itunes.exe or bittorrent.exe. And if Windows detects that running, it will just prevent it from running from the off. So, you've again mitigated not only the risk of any exploits being taken, but also you're preventing the user from, not using a software that complies with sort of the acceptable use policy as well. And again, shift left mentality. The meme on the right again puts it quite well, where you don't just want to remediate the vulnerabilities and have them crop over again and again. So you want to do things, whether it's an education piece. So in the case of Foxit, maybe issue a company-wide email to just say, hey, we found an instance of Foxit from a few years ago. Please be advised that Edge is the company-mandated browser. If you need anything else, raise a request and we can discuss it. Ideally, you'd want to advise them on a better way to do things using company-approved tools. But in the case where Foxit is used, in that scenario, make sure it's uninstalled after that business task has been performed. So that way, it's kind of like a just-in-time type thing where if they need Foxit for next week for a presentation, they install it, or you install it for them. But then once the week is done, you have that action or reminder to say, hey, have you uninstalled it? If not, we're going to uninstall it from your machine. And that way you're preventing it from reoccurring. Yeah, and then the last stage of vulnerability management is to verify. So as I mentioned, it's probably another team that's going to receive the reports you produce and actually remediate. So you can take the word for it, that they've patched, but some people will, either say that just to kind of get you off their back, or just sort of buy themselves some time. But you ideally want to validate their efforts to make sure that those vulnerabilities have been remediated. So how can you do this? So a common way is to just simply run another scan, because you can basically do a differential check between the old scan report or output and the new scan output, and whatever's not there present anymore will be remediated. But it actually goes one step further in the case of Exchange. So I did write a sort of a LinkedIn article about this, which I'm sure one of the West Point guys can link to in the comments or the description. But effectively, what it will do is it will look for specific CVE vulnerabilities associated to Exchange. It knows what versions are present. It knows the detection logic behind that as well. And you can run that before you patch, so you can actually see which vulnerabilities you're exposed to. And then if you run it afterwards, you'll see that vulnerability detected is none. So thereby, you're sure that those vulnerabilities have actually been remediated. And Exchange is a hot topic. Some of you guys may remember proxy logon from March. So this was a series of 4 vulnerabilities disclosed by the NSA. And effectively, they were used once exploits materialized to deliver ransomware. So, a very sort of simple script you can ask your Exchange admins or your IT admins to run to see the current state of your Exchange servers. And once they've remediated them, you can take control back to yourself by rerunning this script and making sure that they actually have been validated. So if you get asked about it later on, you can be confident that, hey, we did remediate this and here's the evidence. So moving on. So I just want to share a bit of personal insight into using 2 products for vulnerability management. So I've used Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, and I've also used Tenbotio, which I'll come on to next. So Defender for Endpoint is an EDR solution. So as I mentioned at the start, EDR solutions are getting much more sophisticated. It's not just an antivirus. They'll look at behavior blocking. They'll fire alerts if any malicious files are detected or triggered. But it also has a vulnerability management component. So it's called Defender TVM, Threat and Vulnerability Management. Now, this is purely software based, so it works on the way of identifying the software present, and it knows the versions and then finds the CVE. So basically, some of you guys may know when Chrome, for example, updates and Google issues a Chrome update statement, they will say this version now fixes, these 13 CVEs. And that's the kind of way Defender does it, because it knows that if you don't update to this version, then you're exposed to these particular CVEs. And that's effectively how it works. In terms of reporting, you can use KQL. So some of you guys may be familiar with Custo query language, which is basically the query language that resides behind the Microsoft security stack. So some of you guys that may have used Sentinel or M365 Defender would be aware of that, but it's just a way to query the data. You can also export things from the portal directly from the GUI cloud-based portal, but I found myself using the KQL queries for sort of tailored reporting and specific analysis behind the scenes, which some of the portal filters and things like that don't allow you to get as granular. But with the queries, you can really drill in to get the data that you need. One other favorite kind of feature of mine was the detection logic. So you can see this on the screenshot on the right-hand side. So every month, Microsoft has Patch Tuesday. It's the second Tuesday of every month. And while you'd assume that all your Windows estate would be vulnerable on day 1 because they haven't updated to that version because literally it's just come out, the Patch Tuesday update that is, you'd be right in thinking so. But more so than that, you'd want to know which specific servers or machines are exposed to specific vulnerabilities. So in the case of a DNS related vulnerability, it's going to look at your Windows servers and say, right, does this server have a role to say DNS server? Because if it does, then it's more likely to be exposed and exploited and things like that. So what it then allows you to do is to say, right, rather than saying, in the case of, let's say, August 2021, you've got 5,000 assets that are vulnerable, you now go down to saying, well, from those 5,000, 4 of them are DNS servers, and these are the vulnerabilities attributed to them. So you know that, for example, if a DNS vulnerability has an exploit, it's a critical, it can be remotely exploited, things like this, then those 4 assets would be your ones to prioritize in terms of reporting as well as remediating. So I really like this detection logic because it allows you to get very specific rather than just seeing holistically that you're vulnerable just because it's a Windows update. And lastly, so Defender for Endpoint works with agent-based, not really scanning, reporting, I guess I could say agent-based reporting. So it allows for a quick reflection of status. So what do I mean by this? So going back to the example earlier where I said you could update a piece of software. So if Defender says, Python is vulnerable on machine 1 because it's version 3.5, as soon as you update to, let's say, 3.6, once the signals feed through to Defender, it will show you that it's no longer vulnerable. Those CVs have been mitigated. And this has 2 benefits. So one is you don't need to do another scan because Defender isn't really scan oriented. It's more, constantly feeding signals through to the portal. But the other benefit is you can very quickly validate that those have been fixed without relying on someone to tell you. So you can very quickly go into the portal and say, right, what was my Python 3.5 exposure? 2 devices. What is it today? 1 device, which means 1 device has been remediated, either through an update or through uninstall. And then, yeah, lastly, Tenable.io. So Tenable is one of the big main players in vulnerability management. So some of you guys may be aware of Qualys, Rapid7, and then Tenable. So these are the 3 big main players. And the way it works is Tenable.io is a cloud-based console. So you set up scanners in your internal environment to probe the assets, and then it will report it to a cloud console. You can also set up sensors in the same way. Tenable also offers you sort of their external cloud scanners to probe assets that are open to the internet or any sort of cloud resources that you just kind of want to get an outsider's perspective on. But if you really want to drill in, it's best to set up scanners or sensors on your internal environment and have them pointing to Tenable.io. The other benefit with Tenable.io, unlike Defender, it's not just software based, but it will flag up issues with certificates and ports, and give you detailed remediation advice as well. So one thing I forgot to mention with Defender is when it identifies a CVE associated to a piece of software, unless it's a Microsoft sort of KB monthly update related, the remediation advice can sometimes be a bit lacking. Usually it's fairly common sense where it will say update to the latest version, but it may not drill in to say, update from 3.5 to 3.5.2. Rather, it will just say update to the latest version. Whereas Tenable.io, because of the plugins and the detections that they do, it's much more specific. And especially around the cases of certificates and ports, sometimes it will even try and not really exploit them, but it will try and show that this certificate being present is not configured correctly, and this is the risk of it. One common one I've seen is like a URL path that was vulnerable. So Tenable.io will specifically show you the path and show you the output of how that path was vulnerable. So it just gives you a bit more information as well. You can schedule the scans all from the console. You can do the dashboarding. You can export the reports all from the console as well. So it's very easy to use. And it's great for management of a lot of assets on a large estate because you can set up different scans for different environments or different business units. The dashboards allow sort of, let's say, less technical people or even high-level C people to just dip in and out if they want to just get a glance of how the estate is going. And yeah, the last sort of, I guess, one of my favorite features as well is the authenticated scanning with Tenable.io. So I touched on this at the start, but authenticated scanning is basically where you provide credentials to your account that's being used to probe the network for vulnerability management of the assets. Now, typically, you'd want to give root level privileges to this account because then it can, penetrate, for lack of a better word, the assets in the most probing way to get as much details as it need from it. But this is obviously a risk to a lot of businesses, and rightly so. So what you can do is you can start off with a sort of simple user account, a standard user account level, and let Tenable do the authenticate scan with that and see what errors you get. And this is where Tenable is really useful because the plugin output will specifically tell you which commands it tried to run and which commands it tried to run and what the output was, so why it failed, what was missing, things like that. And you can effectively work through them until you've minimized those issues or negated them completely. So, just to sort of recap that point, you may be a bit fearful to give root level privileges account to Tenable. So what you can do is start with a user level account, look at what errors and issues you get and sort of work through them. And again, the plugin output is very useful here because it will exactly show you what commands it tried to run. So you can then add those commands to the account to allow it to run. And, as I said, slowly work through them until you've basically mitigated and negated all of those. Yeah, and that kind of brings me towards the end of it. So thank you guys for the time and for the opportunity. Are there any questions?
Hi. Thanks for that, Purav. That was a really great talk. Yes, I think there are some questions there, but I'd like to start with what's the most challenging aspect of vulnerability management you've faced so far?
Yeah, great question, Oscar. I would say the most challenging aspect is getting people to remediate. So I did mention this in the remediation section where, your reports need to be action focused and full of value. But it is quite difficult for the business to actually remediate because a common thing I've seen potentially, po- sorry, a common thing I've seen is the legacy dependencies. So people don't want to update software because they're scared that they'll break things, right? So to remediate this, what I would say is have a demo or a test environment. That way you can test the updates and see how they go, because then it's less likely to break things. But yeah, that's probably been the biggest challenge to actually get people to remediate things. But that also helps in terms of setting up the demo environment. But the other thing that helps, as I alluded to earlier, is actualizing the risk because it's one thing to say, you're vulnerable to Python and this could cause denial of service. It's another thing to say you're vulnerable to Python on a critical DNS server that's remotely exploitable, that if it goes down, it's going to cause loss in availability for our critical service. You need to remediate this now. You'll find yourself getting a lot more backing from the higher level people if you pitch it like that, as opposed to the first example. So doing those two sort of things can help, but it is a bit of a constant battle to actually get things remediated. And that's what I would say has been the most challenging.
Yeah, and for anyone in the audience, if you want to get your comments in down below, or your questions for Parav to answer, this is the time to do it. Shouldn't everyone just patch everything immediately?
Yeah, in an ideal world, that would be nice, wouldn't it? I mean, it's a hard one. You kind of need to adopt that culture in the company to say, if there's a new version out, are we going to automate the update? But then you run into things like I mentioned earlier with legacy dependencies that could break software if it's just updated without sort of being checked. So it's a hard one. I mean, in an ideal world, yes, everything would be up to date, and the best way I've seen an example to say if you don't want any vulnerabilities, just turn the machine off, and it's like it's case in point. Like either you don't use it or you go the other extreme, and it's like you have to kind of find a happy medium between the two to say, you will patch. You can have things like patching policies or SLAs so that in the company, if you identify critical, it should be remediated within 7 days. And if it's not, then you raise a risk that's sort of regularly reviewed and looked at and tried to work through. So things like that can help. But yeah, in an ideal world, you just have like a new version auto update and deploy. But when you're dealing with big infrastructures and estates, unfortunately, it's not that easy.
Someone here's asked about false positive filtering.
Yeah, so in Tenable, you can actually exclude those. So you can say, for example, a vulnerability to do with NFS, which is a file share. So if you know it's going to be a limitation and you don't want it to flag anymore, there is a sort of an exclusion you can put within Tenable. So you can say, don't notify me of this vulnerability on this asset. But more so than that, you can actually put an expiration date. And again, that's helpful for things like when you raise a risk, because as I mentioned, a risk needs to be regularly reviewed. So you could exclude that vulnerability from being shown for a series of few months, and then know that when it flags again, you either need to look at removing it or exclude it again and raise another risk. But yeah, false positives in general. I mean, Tenable's plugin outputs are quite accurate. There are times where I mean, in the case of Defender, I did see a few false positives actually, so I could touch on that as well, where it would show that a particular version is vulnerable. We asked the server team to give a screenshot of their from their sort of logged in perspective of the version, and it does show that it's the updated version, whereas Defender still thinks it's an old version. So I don't know if I'd necessarily call that a false positive. I mean, I suppose it is, but it could just be because there's a delay and there's a latency. And again, similar thing with Tenable. What happens if you've run a scan and the asset has just finished updating just before the scan hit that asset? Then it would show it's vulnerable. But by the time you receive that report, you'd be like, hey, we've already updated this. So usually I'd say false positives are sometimes caused by latency or delays. But if there are things where Tenable or Defender has miscategorized them, especially Defender, Microsoft team are very keen on feedback to improve their product. And in the case of Tenable, again, you have a community portal where you can feed these sort of things back. But yeah, false positives do get in the way, but you just need to validate them as with anything.
Oh, and someone just asked about your slides. For anyone who's interested in the slides, we will be sharing it with you after the fact. I'll get those slides off Parav and we'll put that on LinkedIn. Someone's asked about container security.
Yeah, so container security, I haven't done too much with this, so I'm not too knowledgeable, the best person to speak on this. But yeah, I mean, Tenable does have a container security sort of module. And again, from what I know, in terms of AWS, for example, they have something called a fluid. Is it fluid? I think it begins with a fluid scanning, or basically what it will do is rather than probing the asset, scanning it periodically, it will just send signals from the resources directly to the cloud console. So it allows you again to get a bit more real time and up-to-date information. But yeah, unfortunately, I can't speak too much on container security. It's not something I've done.
Someone, Ganesh is here, has asked, how do you identify vulnerability with AWS or Azure cloud, and how is the remediation for this?
So AWS, I haven't got as much experience in, but in Azure, yep. So there's Azure Security Center, which is Microsoft sort of cloud posture management and workforce sort of piece, where basically it will show all the resources there and assess them. So in terms of vulnerabilities, like you'll see a common one with SQL servers. So it will identify any code that could be vulnerable to SQL injections, and it will give you remediation options as well. So one thing, for example, one basic security policy we should all abide by is to encrypt all data at rest, right? So if you have a SQL server and you haven't enabled TDE, which is Microsoft Azure's way of maintaining encryption, transparent data encryption, then there is a quick fix where it will go and implement that for you. So Azure Security Center recommendations are very good at identifying those vulnerabilities, but more so than that, there are a few quick fix options, which is literally just one click, and it will enable those options for you. But again, it does give you reporting. It does give you alliances to certain compliance standards, like ISO or PCI DSS if you're dealing with any payment card information. But it will very, very clearly tell you vulnerabilities in the Azure security recommendations. Another one, if we're looking at sort of IaaS services for virtual machines, it will tell you if management ports are open. And again, one-click fix, or it will ask you to use something like just-in-time VM access, where, as I mentioned before, someone would have fox it for only a fixed duration and then be removed. Just-in-time VM access will allow someone to log onto that VM for like a few hours, and after that, their access will be revoked. So yeah, Azure Security Center does a good job for informing you of vulnerabilities, but also showing you remediation options. And for some of them, even offering sort of a one-click fix, which is quite nice. But I don't know too much on the AWS front, I'm afraid.
That's completely fine. And what is one small thing you can do to improve vulnerability management in your organization?
Yeah, great question. I mean, a lot of people see vulnerability management as sort of this intimidating field, right? So one small step you could do, I would say, is if you know any projects are coming up, if you can get involved at sort of the solution design level to look at, how is this data going to flow? Is it going to be in a secure way? The machine we're deploying to do this integration runtime, does it conform to the CIS benchmarks? Does it have any ports open that it shouldn't? Does it have, a standard golden image? Does it have any third-party software? If so, what's the versions? Because with that, you're kind of getting ahead of the curve. So you know that when that solution goes live, you've done everything you can to mitigate those risks. And it makes it easier for the vulnerability management team, because then there's less vulnerabilities that will crop up, right? So yeah, if you can get involved in any projects in the early phases, I would say make your concerns known and feed them back to the people working on those servers or implementing those features to make sure that they're done in a secure way at the very early stages.
Okay, well, I think that's everything. I think we can just wrap it up there. Thank you for that, Parav. It was very
Brilliant.
interesting. Anybody interested in the slides, we'll post them afterwards. And if you want to see a full broadcast of this, it will be on our YouTube channel later today. That's West Point Cyber Talent. If you're interested in watching Parav's expert insight, where we ask him more questions about his job and his day-to-day life, that's also on there. But yeah, thank you, Purav, and thank you, everybody in the audience, and I hope you have a nice day.
Cheers. Thanks, Oscar. Thanks for the opportunity.
It's fine. Okay. Bye, everyone.